All right, so I'm really excited to be here. As John mentioned, I have a very strong concern and desire to see people in medicine love the Lord well, love their neighbor well, and think about how we can engage medicine well. And so specifically today, we're living in a society that is rapidly changing, and particularly in the world of medicine, and in the institutions where medicine is propagated. There is a very secular culture, and that culture, the culture, especially for those of you who are in training, they try to form you a certain way. They try to get you to think a certain way. And so what I want to help us think today about, well, how do I engage that in a way that honors God? Now, I think when we think about gospel renewal in secular medical culture, we have to think of it at different levels. But the first and primary level is how the gospel shapes us personally. Okay, and that's something that is very easy to gloss over, but I think it's something that we need to think about and dwell on a little bit, because once the gospel impacts us personally, impacts our concept of what it means to be a physician, then it begins to change our desires for how we engage with medicine as a wider culture. So first off, I want you to think for a second about how we learn medicine. Okay, think about, especially maybe in medical school, when you're learning about something new, you always go through certain stages. You think about pathophysiology, you think about diagnosis, you think about management, and then you think about prognosis. It's no accident that is how we go about medicine. Actually, it's no accident that the entire practice of what we do reflects a certain structure. You see, in our world, we think about patients in health. That's kind of the ideal. That's the wonderful thing. That's how it all began, right? But then disease starts hampering our patients. We see the fall. But then there's a cure. That's what we try to do. We try to find a cure. And we try to help our patients. And then we think about prognosis. We think about the ideal of them having health for the rest of their lives. The very reason that your world and my world is built on that is because that is how God created the world, okay? It's not an accident that that's how things work. God actually created the entire structure of the world, such that he created the world, good, right? There was the fall, there was sin entering into the world, and then Jesus comes as our solution, our sole solution, redemption, the cure, and then consummation and eternity, prognosis. I want you to think about that a little bit because our understanding of the gospel needs to go deep, and it needs to completely shape our worldview. The gospel is not something that we tack onto how we think. The gospel shapes fundamentally how you understand the world, fundamentally how you understand the structure of medicine. How does medicine even work? It is a reflection of how God has actually made the world. And when we begin to think about it in such deep terms, when we begin to think that, oh, actually, down to how I think, down to the things I do day to day are actually a reflection of the gospel, it begins to shape our very image of what the physician is supposed to be. And I say that because there are a lot of ideas out there about what physicians are supposed to be like. The media will give you some, and you will be cultured into certain concepts of what it means to be a physician as well. But I want to read this passage to you from Jeremiah 22. This is God talking to the king of Judah. He is going to judge Judah just as he is going to judge the Babylonians. And this is what he says. Do you think you are a king because you compete in cedar? Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? Then it was well with him. He judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well. Is not this to know me, declares the Lord. You see, the king of Judah had a concept of what it meant to be a king. And of course, you can't draw an exact parallel with medicine. I mean, God creates certain governmental roles with certain ideas in mind. But he had an idea of what it was to be a king. Compete in cedar, build a nice house, have a good home, right? These are concepts that he has adopted from the culture around him. Remember, that is why God's people wanted kings, right? They wanted to be like the nations around them. And yet God says that's actually not what it means to know me. What it means to know me is to judge the cause of the poor and the needy. How you perform your role and your office, how you perform your work as a physician is a direct reflection of whether or not you actually know God. It's a direct reflection of your relationship with the Lord. You see, being a physician can't just be about lifestyle. What do you hear about in your conversations with your colleagues, right? And in class, what are people talking about? When CARMS comes up, when you're talking about, what profession should I go into, or what stream should I go into? Well, this one makes me a lot of money, this one gives me good lifestyle. Those are the things that always come up, because that's what people are interested in. That's what the kings want, right? They want the nice home, they want the cedar, right? But guys, we can't think like that, all right? And the gospel begins to reshape. What does it mean to be a physician? It doesn't mean just that I have the prestige, I have the lifestyle, and so on. See, when we begin to know God, it actually completely changes what we care about. I remember a number of years back, and this has always stuck with me, because this was very impressionable upon me when I was a teenager. I was playing a game called Final Fantasy IX, and there's a scene in the game where, so to run down on the plot. There's heroes, and then there's a bad guy, but the bad guy is the adoptive mother of one of the heroes, okay? So obviously it's dramatic. And they come to this battle, and the bad guy, the mother, is fatally wounded. And then she's dying on the beach. And then the daughter sees this, and she goes up to her mom, and her mom is now changed. Her mom is suddenly like, oh, I regret what I've done. And there's one of the friends of this daughter, one of the friends is watching this scene. And this entire time, he has developed this tremendous hate for this enemy who has just oppressed his people and killed off his people, turned them into tools. But he sees this scene before him, and suddenly he's so conflicted. He's like, I hate her. I'm glad she's dying. But my friend, has this attachment to her, and suddenly I don't know how to feel anymore. Very impressionable when you're 14 years old. But it just struck me, because I started to realize how much you are attached to somebody changes what you care about. Okay, he hated this person, and suddenly he's conflicted, this villain, and now he's starting to have kind of sympathy or empathy for what's going on. And this is actually, again, the Lord tells us this. He says, by this we know we have come to know him, if we obey his commandments. Why do we live our lives a certain way? It's not just because God tells us to. It's because we want to. It's because the more we know God, the more our desires are transformed to match God's desires. And so it's no longer the case that I just, I feel like I need to be a good Christian, and therefore I need to obey, and I need to do all this stuff. No, God actually transforms us from the inside, and we begin to care about these things. This has to be the heart behind why we are talking about anything we're talking about today. If we're talking about reaching people in the secular world, because we also live in a time that's very culturally charged, very politicized, right? Very polarized. And so you can get very amped up about your political party and being on one side of a cultural war for that sake, okay? But that may have nothing to do with your desire to honor the Lord. But it's very easy for us to get caught. I get caught in that too, right? Because it's kind of exciting, and you're like, oh, those are the bad guys, whatever it is. But we actually have to be rooted. This has to be why we evangelize. And we it's really nice, just the songs that we were singing, because what a beautiful name. Do you want people to value God the way you value God? God is so good. And so when people don't recognize that, they don't see that, I'm just like, that is such a shame that you don't see what I see, that you can't enjoy what I am enjoying. If people don't value something you highly value, you're kind of like, what are you talking about? I always think about this one meal that I really enjoy back in Edmonton, which is where I was before I moved here. It's my favorite meal in the city, and anytime somebody said, oh, it wasn't that good, I'd be like, what are you talking about? That's the best, and I want people to value it as it should properly be valued, right? I'll tell you another story. When I was in university, I was at a friend's party. I share this story, so some of you may have heard this. I was at a friend's party, and I didn't know a lot of people at the party, so I'm sitting on the couch, and there's a mutual friend who's sitting there, and I start talking to him, getting to know him, and then I start sharing the gospel with him. We talk for a little bit, and then we kind of part ways. And then another girl comes up to me afterwards, and I knew her because she went to a church that a number of my friends went to. And she came up to me, and she said, oh, that was really interesting. I said, well, what was so interesting about that? She said, well, that you were talking to that guy about Jesus. I said, why is that interesting? Well, because we hear about it all the time in church, but nobody actually does it. And when she said that to me, I was I was so conflicted, But she didn't get it. She didn't get it. She thought it was this task. Oh, like being a good Christian means you got to tell people about Jesus and be awkward about it at the same time. She didn't get it. And I want you to think for yourself right now, even before we tackle any of this stuff. Have you ever wanted to tell somebody about Jesus? I'm not talking about whether or not you've been afraid, or you're like, oh, I'm not sure how to go about that. Have you ever had the impulse? God is good. Jesus saved me. I got to tell somebody about this. If you've never had that impulse, you probably don't know Jesus. Okay? Now, I want you to seriously think about that, because it's so easy for us to be caught in our culture, and I'm supposed to do this, even caught in your Christian culture. I do this because this is what I'm supposed to, but I want you to think about that. All right? That's where it has to begin, because we are caught in our cultural wars. We can't get caught in the cultural wars for the sake of the cultural wars. We have to, first and foremost, be captivated by Jesus, captivated by what he's done for us, to say, yes, he does have a beautiful name. That's why I want to go begin and reach people that don't know him. All right, that was just the intro. Okay, 11 minutes. All right, I got lots of time. So, I want to read this to you. This is what Paul says. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Paul is a master. He knows how to become a Jew to reach the Jews. He knows how to become a Greek to reach the Greeks. What you and I need to learn to do is to become secular to reach the secular. That's not something that we typically think about, something that we typically are partial to. But if you are properly rooted in the gospel, then you can become free to become secular, to reach the secular. Many of you will know the story of Paul in Acts 17 in Athens. He's there by himself. He's kind of going around the city, and he sees all these things that are getting him riled up. But he notices that there is an altar to an unknown God. And here we see Paul in action, and I think this is just one example of many of Paul's examples. There are many examples throughout the Bible. But the Athenians had this legend, okay, that in a season of uncontrollable pestilence, they went to one of their wise men, Epimenides, and they said, oh, there's all this pestilence. We've sacrificed to all our gods. Nothing's happening. What do we do? And he says, sacrifice to the unknown God. They do it, and boom, pestilence is gone. And Paul recognizes this when he begins to talk to them, when he addresses the people on Ars Hill. He connects with them because he says, I see that you guys are very religious, and I see that you have this altar to an unknown God. He's recognizing that there's something in what they're saying that is true. And if anybody's against idolatry, it's Paul. But he's still able to see there's something that you are doing here that I understand that impulse. I understand because, hey, who wants plague? Who wants pestilence? And so you have sought to try to come up with something. And hey, you know what? You've thought about turning outside yourselves. You've turned to the heavens to come up with a solution. Paul is able to connect and make that point. But then, of course, he goes on to say that actually the one unknown God that you're thinking of is actually the one true God. See, he has a very robust understanding of the person, of the human person, and we all need this as well. We all have to recognize every single person is made in the image of God, and every single person is utterly depraved. What does that mean? It means that no matter, I think as Christians, we actually have, well, I think we have the right perspective. We have the most wholesome perspective in this. We recognize that actually the depths of darkness of the human heart are immense. And yet at the same time, we also know that people have been made in the image of God. So there's always something there. There's always something there that we can connect with that is yearning for God through various impulses. Paul knows that. And so he's able to address them and say those things. And the other thing that he does is he communicates to them in their language. He cites their poets. He looks at their authorities. And so he speaks using their authorities to reach them. And he does it differently when he's with different crowds. When he's with the Jews, he says, hey, I'm a Jew of Jews. I've been educated by the best. He doesn't say that when he's with the Greeks. When he's with the Greeks, he's got a completely different approach. We need to know our audience. And we have to realize and become good at saying, how does the gospel actually meet this need and concern that you have right now? Because for many of us, that's what's very difficult. We don't actually know, well, medicine, going to work, how does the gospel make me want to go to work? Right? We need to get good at making these connections, and we need to get good, and the more we are deep in the gospel and recognize how the gospel impacts everything, the more we're able to do that. So if we think about our current setting, our current predicament, I'm going to go through the pathophysiology, diagnosis, and then management. We can talk about prognosis later. If you're a med student, you don't care about prognosis anyways, right? You just want to know what the disease is. So how did we get here? All right. I think about the history of the world in very broad strokes, in the Western world at least, because that's our current setting. And I think of four periods, four periods where there were predominant kind of ideas. You had a Greek worldview, and in the Greek worldview, people believed in divinity, and they believed that the world itself was divine. Right? And so because the world was divine, that was what was good. That's why the philosophers would sit out there and they would contemplate. They would want to know wisdom. How did you know wisdom? You studied the world. Okay. The Christian worldview came along and turned that not completely upside down, but began to say, actually, divinity is not something that needs to be ascribed to the world. It's something ascribed to a personal God. And then through that, you also have the introduction of the image of God. But what's most relevant for us today is that changed that has changed in two major ways. And there's two kind of streams of thought that have developed since then. One was through the scientific revolution, people began to have a high role of human reason. Okay? As God began to fade from the picture, you have to recognize that the organizing principle of the world was lost. So there was actually a crisis. And the crisis was, how do I now make sense of the world when I don't have an organizing principle? What stepped in to organize the world? Reason, human reason. And that's why, and people had to have high faith in human reason because it was the new God. All right? So on one hand, through that stream, we've developed evidence-based medicine. We've developed kind of the more rationalist type approaches. There are problems in and of itself calling that rationalist, but for simplicity's sake, there's kind of that stream. But then you also had another stream that developed, and I think it's one that's more prevalent in the younger generation today, as opposed to the older generation today. And that was the counter kind of enlightenment, the romantic movement. That movement said, hey, you know what? All that sterile reason doesn't speak to the longings of my heart. I don't like it. Reason, sterile, doesn't get me where I need to go. Concurrently at that same time, you had one philosopher who said, now that there's no organizing principle out there, it needs to come from us. So the structure I see in the world actually has to come from my mind. And so it's actually me imposing structure on the world. And there you had this massive shift into the truth of your subjectivity. And so with the counter enlightenment and with this massive shift, you had the rise of the importance of your feelings. And that is, in many ways today, modern existentialism. It's this idea that, hey, there's no God out there. The world out there is chaotic. And so all that you have is you, your existence. And so what is the good life? The good life is you being able to experience things in a way that makes you happy because there's nothing else out there. All there is you. Those are two different streams of thought that are very prevalent in the world of medicine today. One is this idea, well, where's the evidence? Right? People say that all the time, where's the evidence? And I'm not saying it's bad, but you need to begin to tell, is this person someone who kind of subscribes to that scientific kind of rationalistic perspective, or are they somebody that subscribes more to this existential feels perspective, as I like to call it? Recognizing that both of these perspectives are perspectives of authority. Both of them are subscribing to something that they cannot actually defend. At the end of the road, why do you believe that? Why do you believe that? It kind of ends at a certain point, and that high point, or that divine belief, is reason, or it is your feelings. That's just looking kind of in broad strokes at the development of philosophy, and philosophy is useful for that, I think, in that sense, right? Philosophy is the theology of the secular world. That's where we are today. And so what does that look like? How does that manifest in our workplace? How does that manifest amongst people? I think we need to always apply that same gospel kind of creation, fall, salvation, redemption, and then consummation. We can apply that framework to everything that we run into today. So when people are talking about lifestyle and career success, what are they actually looking for? People are looking for salvation. Okay, they think that life is, they want to go back to this time when life is good, like when you were a child, man, it was awesome. And then, but life got in the way and it's so hard, and if I could just get that job, man, if I can just make enough money, whatever it is, then life is going to be good again. People always have these narratives, and we need to get good at seeing them and recognizing how the gospel addresses them. And then on top of that, specifically in our institutions, we have to be good at finding what I like to think of as the echoes of Eden. So what are things that are true, and then what are the things that we need to affirm and reject? For example, you think about all this talk about autonomy. Is autonomy good? Is autonomy bad? Well, our inclination in many circumstances is to say autonomy is a bad thing, and autonomos, like being a law unto oneself, that's the refrain of judges, and it's not looked upon favorably, right? Everybody does what's right in their own eyes. But if you look at it in the context of history, right? In the context of the Greek worldview, where you were, you had this great divine cosmos out there, and you were just subject to fate, and you couldn't do anything about anything. Then it's good in a sense to move forward with autonomy and individual dignity, because in that kind of context, there's something there that is actually valuable. Or when we think about control at the end of life, euthanasia, which is such a hot topic. People have this idea that life is only worthy insofar as I have certain experiences. And that's something that we don't believe. We believe that people inherently have value in their life, but yet at the same time, I think there is something that we can say about it. It is good for us to be proactive in life, and so that there are just different elements that I think we need to try to find and catch on, because that is what is going to be in many ways our point of contact. And how are we going to get good at this more generally? How do you get good at diagnosing anything? It's by exposure. You need to see a lot of it, and you need to be around it a lot. Now, I've noticed this tendency in myself, and I'm sure many of you notice this tendency as well. As you get older, I'm obviously not that old, but as you get older and you have a family and you have kids, you tend to, your social circles shrink. Who you begin to hang out with becomes more and more narrow. But we need to be very effortful at being amongst other circles and to be amongst not just believers. And practically, that's not that easy for me. I'm not actually that sociable of a person. And so when my colleagues like to go out after work, I don't like to go out after work, all right? I'd rather go home and sit and read or whatever it is. But I very, very purposefully make this decision. You know what? Oh man, I need exposure, right? I gotta learn this, and I gotta know what people care about, right? And obviously, you can do that from one perspective that's saying, I just gotta learn the diagnosis. No, but I like my colleagues. So I go out and I try to be amongst my colleagues and to hang out with them. Because the other thing that we need to remember, when's the last time you tried to invite someone to church? Inviting people to church nowadays, especially young people, it's weird, right? People are what church? What is that? I don't want to go to church. People are not comfortable in church, okay? And that's not how Jesus did it, right? Jesus goes into the world and he finds people in the world, right? Where people are in their comfort zones, where we're in our comfort zones, and he goes to them. And that's what we need to do. You need, honestly, and obviously you need to take this with a grain of salt, but you need to start going to some parties. Huh? You need to go to parties. You need to be in these cultural gatherings where people are comfortable. And because that's precisely how Jesus did it. And I remember when I started residency, I did it more at the beginning. I kind of petered out at the end. But I did it a lot more at the beginning. Because, partially, one example I think about is, it was kind of like the residence retreat, and so we're all at the hotel together, and obviously people are drinking, but, they're more apt to talk when they're drinking. And we're just kind of hanging out, and people are relaxed, people are relaxed. And I just start striking up conversations, and I'm talking with people about, how's residency been going, and eventually move to start talking about some spiritual conversations. But, when people are at these parties, they're confined to a room, pretty much, right? Everybody has to be there. And so it's easy to have conversations with people, and people aren't just running out. And so people overhear conversations. I remember there was this atheist guy, as I was talking with one of my colleagues, there was an atheist saying, oh, you guys are having such a hardcore conversation. But he listened in on it, and he found it very interesting, okay? But all I'm saying is, look, if you're not at that gathering, you're not going to have that conversation. And nobody else is going to overhear it, right? We need to be in the cultural places. We need to be where people are comfortable and they're willing to talk. And that starts kind of going into management, right? Like how we're supposed to do things. But one of the things that I think is important for us to remember just more generally is that we're concerned about the heart, right? For those of you who are very apologetics-minded, right, we have to recognize that when we're trying to convince people of truth, or when we're trying to engage with people about truth, we have to be talking about things that people care about. I remember when I was in Scotland doing like a short-term mission there, when I was with Power to Change, we would share on campuses. And I remember being struck by how many times I think what I said was truthful and compelling, and people just didn't care. They're like, "Oh, that's nice." Like there was this degree of apathy there, and I didn't know what to do about it because I was like, "Yeah, but I said the right things. Like, what's going on here?" But that's where we are today, especially when you're amongst a culture of people that are very feels, right? They're all about how they feel, how something makes them feel, and you need to especially hit them kind of where it's something that concerns them. And the reality is, the gospel is relevant in every single culture, and the gospel confronts different problems in every kind of culture. And we have to remember that because we know there's something that we can always share and connect with for people over. So thinking about management in kind of broad terms, the first thing I've kind of already touched on is we need to build friendships with people. And for some of you, you're like, wow, that's obvious. But for me, it's not that obvious because I told you I'm kind of introverted. But we actually need to be dedicating time to building friendships with people that we're not necessarily just comfortable with or we kind of default to hanging out with. First off, that's kind of where exposure happens. But second, as people get to know you, we're living, especially in the academic world, a lot of people don't know Christians. They don't actually know Christians. So what do they think about when they think about Christians? They think about what they see on TV. They think about bigots. They think about haters. When people actually meet Christians, and they're like, oh, like you don't just hate people all the time, that's actually surprising to people. All right? That's actually surprising to people. But we remember, and we have to be aware, what are the perceptions that people have about us? But as you begin to build friendships with people, you challenge that. And that's not even a declare, plant my flag, like I follow Jesus, like declaration. That's just people getting to know you, and as they get to know you, they will come to know that you are a believer. When we think about this idea of being an ambassador of Christ, like these are reflections that people, this kind of reflects on what Christianity is when you meet people who are Christians. One of the other things that we need to get good at is we need to learn to be subversive. That initially kind of makes us, well, like, what do you mean? Like underhand, like that cunning, like, what does that mean? There's a funny chapter in the Bible, Luke 20. And in Luke 20, Jesus gets asked a lot of questions, and he doesn't really answer any of them. He doesn't give straight answers to people. You can't predict what Jesus is going to say. People are asking him, who's giving him authority to do all sorts of things. And he starts asking about John's baptism. Is that from heaven? And then they're like, ugh, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to that. Hey, is it right to pay taxes? Well, he doesn't really give you a straight answer for that one either. Give me a coin, right? People are trying to trap him, with whose wife will this person be if they've had so many marriages or whatever the case may be. And he starts talking about the burning bush. Like those are not, honestly, like if you're in clinic or something and you're trying to ask your preceptor for something and they give you an answer, you're like, right? But we got to be like that. We have to give people answers that they're not expecting because people think they know what we're going to say. And we shouldn't say those things. Because we shouldn't fit in those boxes. The rich young ruler. What must I do? He assumes he can do something to get into heaven. But Jesus understands the anatomy of unbelief. It doesn't work like that, right? What's really involved in the barrier to faith here? It's not just an intellectual matter, it's a matter of the heart. So we need to get good at that. We need to get good at keeping people on their toes. So this breed, these Christians, they're a little different from what I expected. I'll give you one example. I did grand rounds once on abortion. Hot topic, right? But I didn't really talk about abortion by talking about abortion. I talked about philosophical principles. I talked about approaches to ethics. And like, people aren't going to get that mad when you talk about utilitarianism. That's not a term that charges people the way abortion does, right? That's kind of a backdoor entrance to talking about these kinds of things. And through that, I remember, because I knew who this was at Grand Round, so I knew a number of the people in the audience, and some people who are very on both sides of the spectrum. And both sides of the spectrum, people seem to enjoy the talk because they realized that this wasn't something about just bringing out this hot topic and just fighting about it, but looking at it from a different perspective. It kind of disarmed people. But through that, I was also able to show people that there are actually underlying beliefs behind why you think abortion is a good or bad thing. Right? The issue really isn't abortion. When we talk about euthanasia, the issue really isn't euthanasia. It's that underlying systems belief that tells you that euthanasia is a good or bad thing. But most people don't think about it at that level. We come in through the back door. One of the things that we can do as well is help reframe even the issues that people are concerned about. Because there's a lot of ideas in the Christian worldview that are kind of odd. Like sin, sacrifice. These are kind of things that people don't really connect with. They think it's odd. But people understand things like work-life balance, right? That's such a hot topic, right? Everybody knows about work-life balance. And what is work-life balance? Well, work-life balance is a matter of, where do I place my time and energy? Where do I place my loves? Right? Augustine talked about ordering of loves. Right? And there are certain things, like God should be at the top of our ordering of loves. And when we misplace our love, that is, in a way, sin. We understand language about love. We understand language about work-life balance, and maybe I love this too much or I love that too much. We don't understand language about sin. But we can communicate the language of sin to people by using things that they understand, like love. And that as a general principle, is about building the bridges, right? It's about finding, as Paul did, the kinds of things that, like, we're appealing to the authorities that other people have, the kinds of things that they're interested in. I'll share a few examples. One other time I did Grand Rounds, I talked about euthanasia. And what are the things that we tend to value? What are the things that people value in secular culture in our institutions today? Pluralism. Multiculturalism, right? All cultures. We need to give a fair kind of hearing to all cultures. And through the Grand Rounds and other talks that I've given, I've always tried to help people see that secularism is a culture. Secularism is one culture amongst many. And so, and I try to draw sources from various authorities in the philosophical literature and the sociological literature to help people see, actually, yeah, but the multiculturalism that people want to hold on to, that's like a commitment that they have. That's a hard issue for them, right? They want to be open-minded and multicultural, so they don't want to give that up. But at the same time, when you talk about secularism being just one of those cultures, and so we can't really place the secular perspective over other cultures, then people begin to have a conflict. Being in these settings, and I talk about multiculturalism, the other thing is I play up all the time that I'm not white, right? I'm Asian, and people love it because you can't say anything bad about him because we want to be multicultural, and I don't want to, right? And I say all the time that I grew up in a different culture, and things don't work that way in my culture, right? But people listen, right? That's like, I'm being totally straight with you guys. Like, these are just mechanisms that operate because these are the things that carry authority, right? I don't do that if I'm not talking with, like, in the same kind of secular environment, all right? Like, I don't say, I got a degree in theology. Like, people don't care about that, right? But, he's Taiwanese, and his culture, well, I don't want to be, against Taiwanese people, right? Those are just examples of ways in which you kind of get an audience a little bit, all right? One of the other kind of points of contact that I've found has been effective, palliative care. Right? Palliative care is a relatively new area in medicine. And one of the things that people don't talk about a lot in palliative care, they talk about it, but confronting very deeply this question of meaning. And that's something we don't talk about a lot in medicine in general. because we're very concerned with pathophysiology. We're very concerned with what medicine can I use to cure this problem or whatever the case may be. But meaning is actually it's a big problem, right? How do I make sense of what I'm actually experiencing? Like, how do I make sense of disease? And so I was actually at a conference, and I put that idea out there. How do we actually make sense of what we're doing? Because the problem is we don't tend to stop and think about that. And at the same time, well, actually, the idea that we're kind of propagating amongst ourselves is this life is all you got. So if you have a bad disease, like, you're toast. Like, that's it. Like, your life sucks. There's nothing else. And so it's kind of weird for us to try to give people hope or try to say, like we don't have a lot of resources to deal with disease in the secular worldview. And again, it's one of those things but people actually care about that, but it's not something that's addressed in the medical curriculum. And so people have responded favorably to that. Just this idea, okay, when we can explore other things. Another hot kind of buzzword, right, is like spirituality, right? And there's academic kind of credibility that you can have with that now because a lot of people are doing work in spirituality or whatever. But my point is just those are kind of authorities that can be employed. Those are authorities that you can use, and you can bring them into context. Because the moment you talk about meaning, like, you're getting very, very close to talking about you're talking about fundamental truths about the world. And that creates a space for me in those contexts to talk about the gospel. Because I'm talking about how, well, this is how we think about meaning. Well, this is how other people think about meaning, like Taiwanese people. But just using, again, creating vehicles, creating space. Because if you just come out there and just start telling people that, the only way you can have robust meaning is the Christian worldview or whatever, people aren't going to listen to that. Okay? We need to find back doors. We need to find ways to soften people up. Last example I'll use is one of the things that has obviously become a big issue in a lot of schools is concerns about transgenderism and how are we as Christians supposed to engage? How should we think about that? Well, the transgender perspective is, as we saw before, it comes from a certain vein of thought, right? So transgenderism in and of itself is a hot topic. But how can we talk about transgenderism or address the underlying beliefs? Well, that would pertain to truth being something that I define on my own terms, right? That's not quite as controversial as talking about something like transgenderism. And so the Lord gave me, he just presented these opportunities for me to be involved in medical education, and through medical education to give talks about entitlement. Because what do people who control the gates to letting people come into their classrooms, what do they care about? What do these educators care about? They don't like it when they're entitled, or when their learners are entitled. Right? What does it mean to be entitled? It means, well, the world revolves around me. The world revolves around what I care about. But the educators don't like that. And so that gives me free rein to talk about entitlement. But the underlying issue behind entitlement, and the underlying issue behind so many issues that we find controversial, like transgenderism, it's the same ideology. It's this idea that the world revolves around me. You got to do what I feel is best, okay? But you want to talk about transgenderism, you're never going to get an audience with an entire medical class, and there's no way an administrator will let you talk about it. You want to talk about entitlement, that's something they care about. And so they'll give you the audience to talk with people. These are just examples. Okay? These are just examples of things that we need to be thinking about, of how can we communicate with people. One of the other things that we need to do is we need to do this together. And I think we've actually done quite poorly at this. Most of us, especially in medicine, and especially after medicine gets busy, we go about things on our own. And me too. Like when I get busy and my head's down, I'm just trying to survive medicine, whatever. But we have to recognize, like, there's a lot of people in this room. And there's a lot of people that can help other people in this room. And what we need to do is we need to find ways to connect with one another to actually help each other in the medical world. Back when I was still in Edmonton, at our church, we had a healthcare small group. And so everybody in our small group was in nursing, physiotherapy, in medicine. And we would actually sit together and we would say, how can we do something together? How can we engage our environments together? And that palliative conference that I was telling you about that I spoke at was actually organized by another believer. And he knew me, and he knew that I've given various public talks, and he said, well, let's get Lester to talk to people. Right? There was an example there of just a kind of coordination. And in that, there were a number of believers that were in kind of the group, and they were able to talk with people about what I had said afterwards as well. See, we have that is us bringing church into the secular spaces. It was like literally, it was like me standing in front of a bunch of people, like preaching at them, pretty much, and then having people talk about the sermon afterwards. Okay, but we managed that because we had people working together. How can we do this together? How can we make that happen? And there's been a few examples like that. So we need to think about that, and that's why it's nice, when we have these kinds of gatherings, because people can connect and people can get to know one another. One other management point: increasingly, living a Christian life makes you look weird, makes you stand out. The Roman Emperor Julian said this: "These impious Galileans," so he's referring to the Christians, "support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone sees that our people lack aid from us." And it made him furious. It was so obvious to him that these Christians were going out and they were doing things when everybody else was not. And this is a common theme throughout the Bible. We glorify God, people see our acts, our works, and they glorify our Father who is in heaven. It's hard for people to malign you when you're helping people all the time. And these are things that we need to do collectively as well, because then you have more of a presence. And specifically, what I've noticed as well is there are a lot of things that tip people off as to whether or not somebody kind of in your context is a believer. Because one of the other things that I do, I'm always like scouting out, who are the believers here? And so I talk to people, do you know this person? Oh yeah, that person's a Christian, whatever. But that you want to know who are the people in the community or in the environment that share your convictions. But there are little things that can help you do that. If you ever mention that you go to church, if somebody asks you, oh, what church? They're probably a churchgoer themselves, right? Little things like that. Or one that I get a lot is when somebody's really young and they're married and they got kids already, right? That they're probably religious, right? They're either Mormon or they're Christian. That's what I found. But just little things like that to kind of you scope out your environment, right? But then as you get to know people, then you can connect with people and you can live in ways that are a little bit different. I want you to think about what are very typical things and how can we do things in an atypical way. When you meet up with somebody, what is a very normal thing to do? Oh, you go out for coffee. A very, very normal thing to do. You go to some random third-party space and pay somebody money, and then you sit in their cafe and you drink coffee and you talk. But if you invite somebody over to your house instead, hey, why don't we have coffee at my place? And you can come to my place. That throws people. It's a little bit unpredictable. But people also, granted, in context, you got to do this with people you know, and so it's not so weird. But what you're beginning to show is that you don't have the same kind of values. You're not necessarily trying to keep people at a distance. Actually, I want you to be in my home because I want you to be in my life. Little things like that. And this is what I mean by subversion. These are small things. These are not big things. You're not full on laying out the gospel for people. You're just acting in a way that shows that you don't necessarily have the same values, or that you're doing things in a way that's a little bit different, and that begins to pique people's interests. Invite people into your homes. Right? That's especially amongst young millennial professionals, that's quite uncommon. Right? It's more and more uncommon for people to do that, unless they're your best friend. But this is how you build your relationships. You can do these kinds of things. The other thing, and this I've found has been a powerful kind of testimony, is we really need to actually inconvenience one another. And nobody likes that, especially if you're a young urban professional. You don't like being inconvenienced because your whole life is about you, okay? And now you have the means to do what you want to do. But we actually need to inconvenience one another and to do that regularly. because that prevents us ourselves from becoming siloed in our own way of living. But it also begins to show, whoa, that's kind of unusual that this guy would do that for that other guy. My daughter, this was several months ago. My daughter fractured her collarbone, but I didn't want to have to take my other son to the hospital, so my wife stayed at home with my son, and then I needed to go to the hospital. I could have called an Uber. I could have called a taxi. No, I called my friend, and I said, I'm inconveniencing you, man. Come and help me. And he comes over, and he drives me to the hospital, and then I forget if he went home, and then he came back and drove me back. But anyways, and that was an anomalous thing for people to hear about. Because you can just call an Uber. Like, isn't that easier? It's actually easier to call an Uber and just pay to have an Uber. But the whole point is, we're doing life together. See, what Uber is for people that don't have people to call. That's why you use Uber when you fly somewhere else and you land in a city where you don't know anybody and you need to get from the airport to someplace because you don't know anybody. But if you have close friends there, you call your friends. Okay? We need to begin to inconvenience one another because that is not the way people live today. We need to inconvenience one another and say, your inconvenience becomes my inconvenience. Let's do life together. That's part of the reason why it's so hard for us to engage our culture together, because we don't even do life together. We don't inconvenience one another even within the church. And how are we supposed to be on mission together if we can't even inconvenience each other for little things like that? If you are young and able, babysit some kids, all right? My friend, this same friend, came over all the time to our house. And he's a single guy. And we invited him all the time into our house. And my kids love him. He came and he visited here, and the kids were ecstatic to see him. That's kind of weird for a lot of people. But he was a part of our life. He was a part of our life. And we need to be a part of one another's lives. It's increasingly countercultural. When my son was born, our church put out a call schedule so that when the phone call was made, there were people that were ready to rock. There were people that came to our house to babysit our kids. And there were people that came to the hospital to bring us food. There was a call schedule that was put in place that inconvenienced them, but hugely blessed me and my family. I've shared that story with multiple of my colleagues because my wife went into labor when I was on call. And I distinctly remember this because, again, that same atheist guy that had heard that conversation when everybody was drinking, I told him that story. He's like, man, you know what? That's actually really nice to be part of a church. This guy doesn't go to church. He's pretty aggressively secular. And yet at the same time, that has just communicated something to him that actually there's something nice. And he volunteered that, I don't know, just extract that from him. And he just volunteered that information because he saw how that has been such a benefit, or it's been such a wonderful thing. Those are subversive things, guys. Those are not things that are right in your face. They're little ways that we undermine the narratives, the ways that we undermine the current structures and the ways that people think about things. Just kind of putting it all together. I think we need to be a lot more intentional, all right? Especially when we're at events like this, especially when we're hanging out, because people are going to try to silence what we have to say. And I don't have, by any means, do I have all the answers. I don't know how to figure out all this. I mean, these are things that I've learned as I've gone and I've talked with other people, but that's just part of it. I've had people around me to say, hey, that's too aggressive, don't do that. Or, whatever the case may be. I've had people, because I need help, and we all need help, and we all need wisdom, we all need input. And that's something that we need to do collectively. And the other thing that I would just add, because we do this collectively, we all have different roles. Not everybody is going to get up in front of a lot of people and give talks, right? But because we're doing this collectively, we all know that we also still have a role in that. Yeah, some people do talks. Some people are great at that individual level. Like me, can barely stand being with lots of people for very long periods of time. We need to recognize that we all have our different strengths, and we need to kind of put that all together and work at things together, okay? We need to preach this to ourselves on a daily basis, and remember that first and foremost, this has to begin in Look at what God has done for me. I love the Lord. My heart is shaped. That's why I love my community. That's why I love the people around me. Okay, let me just pray. Lord, thank you so much for this gathering and for all the people here. Lord, I'm encouraged that there are so many people here. And Lord, I am also very aware that it would give Satan great pleasure if we all left here today and continue to live exactly the same way. And Lord, I pray against that. I pray that you would stir up in each one of us a deeper and greater knowledge of who you are. And Lord, may that be the impetus behind why we love our neighbor and why we care for one another. Lord, you are great. And I want people to know that. I want people to see that we're all beggars, and yet you have given us the food that is for forever. And God, help us to do that. And may you be glorified in all of these things. In Jesus' name, amen.